I'm Peter Williams, and we do this talk as a double-headed thing. I'm going to do the first section, and then Mark will take over halfway through. And this is a talk we've delivered a couple of times in Forest Gate, but we have adapted it a bit, and hopefully you will also see some familiar images that are closer to St. Peter's in the Forest as well, just to bring it home a bit for sort of Leytonstone and South Walthamstow. So the first image I'm going to show is a modern estate agent in Forest Gate, and I make no apologies for starting with an estate agent, because this is a story that is about speculation, about housing development, about the coming of the railway and rapid change in East London. And although our story focuses on the history and the 19th and the early 20th century, it's also very relevant to the 21st century, because there are some striking parallels between what went on 100, 120 years ago and what's going on at the moment. You only need to think about the coming of the rapid CrossRail rail link to Forest Gate and the kind of changes that's making. And certainly these processes of gentrification, decline, and gentrification again is a pattern we will see. This is a map from the late 18th century of sort of East London, and what is the modern London borough of Newham, with Waltham Forest just to the north. And what strikes you in this map, of course, is that it is a place of really small villages, and in some cases not even villages, just very small hamlets clustered around a road junction, or in some cases a church. And it was and remained a very rural area really until the mid 19th century, when things really began to take off. And this process of sort of suburbanisation went in waves out from central London, hitting Newham perhaps a few years before it hit Waltham Forest. And just zooming in on that map to the kind of modern area of Forest Gate. Some of you may know Wood Grange Road that runs the sort of main shopping street through Forest Gate. And there is Wood Grange on the map, oddly misspelt actually, spelt Wood Grange, but it should be Wood Grange. And you can see at the top there, it says lower, and that says Lower Forest, and that's the very lowest part of Epping Forest, as Forest Gate marks the kind of southern boundary. And there's a pub there, Mark, called the Eagle and Child, and just bear that in mind, because we'll come back to the Eagle and Child a couple of times. So this map shows, as I say, the modern area of Forest Gate. And a more modern map from about 1900, and you begin to see this rapid urbanisation, suburbanisation spreading out from Tower Hamlets on the left through Stratford and beginning to make an impact on the area south of Wanstead Flats. But East Ham still quite open, some quite open fields in East Ham at 1900, but they filled up rapidly in the period just before the First World War and just after, so that suburbanisation was complete up to the Ilford boundary by about 1930. We say gentrification in the title of this talk, and it's a bit of a play on words, but one of the things that strikes you about the Newham area, Newham, by the way, is just made up of West Ham and East Ham. They were amalgamated in 1965. Newham is an entirely made-up name, invented in 1965. It's got no historical basis. And some of you will be pretty familiar with West Ham and East Ham, which were separate county boroughs. And one of the things that strikes you about the area in the 18th and indeed the early 19th century is these very substantial, what we're going to call gentry houses. And we'll show you some pictures of a number of these. This is one of the most famous in West Ham. And this park here forms the core of the modern West Ham Park, owned and managed by the Corporation of London now. But this is what it was like in the historic period, and was the site of quite a famous and important botanical garden. So there's one of the gentry houses. Here's another. This obviously is a photograph from probably around about 1900. This is now, in fact, a territorial army base. The house doesn't survive. But this house is quite famous because of its connections with Quaker families. There was an important cluster of Quaker houses and Quaker families in this area in what was then called the sort of hamlet of Upton, what is now in the modern Upton Park. And yes, there were these cluster of Quaker families, very important, very powerful, pretty wealthy. And I'll just mention some of their names and they may be familiar to you. There's the Fry family, and their most famous member is probably Elizabeth Fry, the prison reformer. But the family is also connected to Fry's chocolate. Another family that you will have heard of is the Barclays, who were Quakers and had a presence in this area, and they later went on to create Barclays Bank. And then there were other families. One of the most important to the development of the area was, in fact, the Gurneys. They were bankers, Quakers, very successful business people. And the Gurney family owned a great deal of land in what is now Forest Gate and sold that land off for development. So a very important place for these gentry houses, quite a few of which were occupied by Quakers. We do flip backwards and forwards a little bit in this talk, in this version that we've done for St. Peter's, because we wanted to draw attention to sort of things in your particular area. Some of you will recognise this property. This is by the Churchill statue in Woodford, and this is Hurst House, sometimes known as the Naked Lady, named after a statue that used to be in the garden. And this property survives to this day as a sort of multi-million-pound dwelling. And this is another one of these gentry houses. This dates from the early 18th century, around about 1715, and was originally the home of a Wapping merchant, a merchant in the docks. And they had their country seats away from the hustle and bustle of the docks and of London in the deep countryside, and which Woodford was, and indeed West Ham was. So there's one of the gentry houses more in your area. Another gentry house is this one. We're back in West Ham now. This does not survive. In the 19th century, this was home to a man called Tanner. And then it was bought by the Tottenham and Forest Gate Railway Company. You'll know that better as the Barking Gospel Oak Line in its modern terminology. But the Tottenham and Forest Gate was developed in the latter part of the 19th century, 1890s, and they bought this property as part of their railway works. They in the end didn't need it for the line. The line, in fact, passes just behind this, and this property was sold off to the West Ham School Board. It was briefly used as a furniture depository for the school board, and then was demolished, and a school was developed there. It's actually a double school site. Wood Grange School and Godwin School now sit on the site of this. But interestingly, just round the corner is this building, which does survive. And this was part of that West Ham Hall estate. This is the coach house. And for some reason we don't quite understand, the coach house survives in the modern streets. This is where they would have kept the coach and the horses. It's now used by a company that makes glass vessels for laboratories, small, highly specialised workshop. It still functions. Forest Gate, not surprisingly, is named after a forest gate, and this is an image of that gate in the mid-19th century. It was not exactly a toll gate. It is referred to as a toll gate, and you can see in this old drawing it's called a toll gate, but it's not a toll gate in the ordinary way you might think of it. There wasn't, as far as we know, a charge for vehicles or people to pass by. What there was a charge for is for cows to pass by. So this marked the kind of southern edge of the forest. And cows going to market at Smithfield would be walked down this road and then walk down the Mile End Road or the Whitechapel Road to the Smithfield market. There was a toll on the cows passing through, and they passed through in huge numbers. And we're just in the process at the moment, actually, of writing a small booklet about the cow trade, and that will be out in the next few months, hopefully. So this gate finally disappeared in the early 1880s. And its location in the modern geography, for those of you who know Forest Gate, this is exactly where the gate was. In the background there, you have the Barking Gospel Oak Railway Bridge. On the left, the Lord Lister Health Centre. And on the right, the Eagle and Child pub. We've seen the Eagle and Child on the 1777 map. Here's the Eagle and Child. The building survives. This is a Victorian building. There was a much earlier building. The pub goes back several hundred years. This is a Victorian building, sadly no longer a pub. It's now a pharmacy, but the Eagle and Child is still a notable location in Forest Gate. I've talked about cows, which were a very important part of the local economy. And some of you, of course, will remember the cows still wandering around Wanstead Flats, Leytonstone Flats, and the Southern Forest until the 1990s. But this picture is to remind us that it was an extremely rural area, really right through to the 1850s. And this is a very important farm. This is Aldersbrook Farm. Some of you will know the Aldersbrook estate just south of Wanstead Park. This farm is very important because it was bought in the early 1850s by the Corporation of the City of London with the express purpose of constructing a cemetery. And many of you will know the City of London Cemetery, and that sits on this site. The farm, in fact, was moved just along the road, and it sat from 1850 onwards. It sat on Aldersbrook Road, and is the location of the current Esso petrol station on Aldersbrook Road, which some of you may know. And that petrol station was originally a farm selling petrol in sort of 1920s. It is now a full-scale petrol station. And it was this farm, it was the purchase of this farm by the City of London that led eventually, through a rather complex story, which we won't go into tonight, how the City of London came to be the conservators of Epping Forest. So we talked about the rural area, but of course it began to change very dramatically when the Great Eastern Railway was constructed in the late 1830s. And we found this rather charming painting showing the line from Stratford towards Ilford, passing through the sort of Forest Gate Manor Park area. And again, it emphasizes its rather rural character in the early days. Forest Gate Station opened in the very early 1840s, but actually almost as soon as it opened, it closed again because there weren't enough passengers, because it was kind of in the middle of nowhere, really, and in a rural area. And the railway company actually closed it for a couple of years until sort of passenger numbers built up. And the original station was very, very small, and then was later rebuilt in the late 19th century, and of course became a major sort of commuting station, and Mark will touch on that. I'll just leave you to read this slide just for a moment. So the coming of the railway led to a very, very dramatic change in Forest Gate. For the fairly obvious reasons, it gave Forest Gate access to London with all its jobs and its wealth. There was rapid building of houses, so rents were relatively low. And a first-class local market refers to the quality of the shopping that could be found in Wood Grange Road at the time, with many very fine, quite posh shops, some of which survived well after the Second World War. But then, of course, the area went into some decline and is now in the process of bouncing back in the way these waves of gentrification work. And we'll talk about that a bit more. The rate of urbanisation in West Ham is really quite extraordinary, as this graph shows. We've become used, I think, because of COVID in the last 18 months to exponential growth and exponential graphs. Well, here is one. An extraordinary rapid rise of population from almost nothing around the time of the Napoleonic Wars, just these tiny villages you've seen on the map. And then from the 1850s, the coming of the railways and the rapid growth of London. London went perhaps from a city of about 1 million people in the late 18th century to a city of 7 million people by the First World War. So extraordinary growth. And West Ham, perhaps of all places, had maybe the most rapid growth with the docks, industrialisation, and the building of huge numbers of houses. Again, I'm not going to read this slide out. It's just for you to glance over. It just gives you some idea of the sort of demography of Forest Gate in the late 19th century. I think what's striking about this is that it is actually quite mixed. It certainly had its gentry and its middle class. Well, the gentry, the true gentry, actually left as they sold off their estates. They moved out into the deeper countryside. But the middle classes came in, and you can see some middle class occupations there. But there were also other types of occupations, and a very, very mixed community. And of course, to this day, Forest Gate remains a very mixed place, despite the impact of gentrification in recent years. We are very interested in the plaques that you find on houses. It's very rare, however, to actually find a plaque that names the builder of a house. You get these fancy names like Osborne or Edith, or they're often named after the royal family in the late 19th century, Windsor and Osborne and all these. But this one, this is in Montague Road in Leytonstone. This actually names the builder, Dupre, 1887. So that's quite an unusual plaque, but it's always worth looking at the plaques because it dates the houses. The actual development process was quite interesting because, and this Ordnance Survey map sort of illustrates that. So if you look the sort of bottom half of the map, you see these kind of broken terraces, because terraces were often built in very, very small blocks by speculative builders. They might only be building 5 or 6 houses. The big landowners sold off in plots and then found a builder developer who might only build a tiny terrace. So you get these kind of odd little isolated terraces. And it was only later that they were all knitted together and became coherent long terraces as we're used to. But notice at the top of the map, the terraces are very coherent, very even. And that's because north of the Romford Road, at the top of the map, there was a single controlling mind deliberately developing a sort of villa estate. And that was a family called Corbett. They developed many estates around. There's one in Ilford as well. But one of their most famous is that area on the top of the map there. That's called the Wood Grange estate. And on that map was another one of these gentry houses. This is Plashett Hall, but its common name was Potato Hall. That's what the local people called it, because the family that lived here, the Greenhills, made a great deal of money from growing potatoes and onions and other vegetables in what is now East Ham. They were obviously very successful at it, but they had other business interests as well. And they had shipping interests, and that is said to be why there's a lantern on top of the house. So Mr. Greenhill could go to the top of the house and see the masts of his ships on the Thames 3 miles away or so. So Potato Hall, it was demolished in the late 19th century. It was on the corner of Catherine Road and Romford Road. It was demolished in the late 19th century and in fact became a council tramway depot briefly before being built over for smaller houses. Potato Hall does not survive, but this one actually does. This is 89 Dames Road in Forest Gate. It was also known as Forest Lodge historically, and was occupied by one of the families who were the developers of suburban Forest Gate, a family called Dames, and there's a Dames Road. This house sits just off Dames Road. It's had a rather checkered history, like many buildings in East London. In 1900, it was occupied by a wealthy widow, but in the pre-Second World War period, it actually became the base of a catering company. It went into commercial use and wasn't really residential. And that the commercial catering company actually stayed there until the 1980s and the 1990s, when it was divided up into flats and went back into residential. So in a way, the building tells the story of the changing Forest Gate from the wealthy gentry house to the to the commercial building, and then back into owner occupation. And this is Dames Road, just up from where that previous picture was taken. We like this picture for a couple of reasons. One, the delightful urchins at the bottom, they're playing in what is called the model yacht pond, now called Jubilee Pond, still there on Dames Road. But this picture is of particular interest because over on the left there, you can actually see houses under construction and wooden scaffolding. Very, very rare to find photographs from about 1900, perhaps 1895, of houses under construction. In fact, this, I think, is the only photograph we know actually showing the process of building in progress. And there's the road today. We couldn't get exactly the same angle because the lake, unfortunately, is in the way. The lake is slightly bigger than it was in Victorian times. We'd have to stand in the lake to repeat the view exactly. But I've counted the chimneys. I can assure you that is the same row that was being built in the 1890s. And again, I'll just leave you a moment just to read that about Dames Road. Notice that the chief inhabitants are clerks and businessmen in the city. So Forest Gate, not surprisingly, was a commuter village, a commuter place, a commuter suburb. There was this army of clerks, of course, mostly male at the period, travelling in by train to the City of London to work in all the offices, and of course people who had business in the city. So that was the kind of raison d'etre of this rapid suburbanisation in Forest Gate. And the book we quote here, this 1907 study, is a gold mine. It's online, it's digitised, so you can look at it over the internet. It's fantastic. And it's a gold mine of very detailed information about West Ham just before the First World War. Again, just shifting focus for a second. This is E11. This is Woolwood Road, just behind Whipps Cross Hospital. And we just show you this picture to say that, of course, this process of suburbanisation went in waves out from the centre of London, and it reached this part of what is now called Upper Leytonstone by estate agents in about 1870, 1880, almost contemporaneous with Forest Gate, but these houses are on a slightly grander scale than Forest Gate, and it's got a sort of nice rural feel. This track, in fact, this road was, if you studied the maps carefully, it was a farm track until mid 1860s, leading to something called Woolwood Farm. And there was a big Woolwood house, again, a gentry house, occupied by a merchant family called the Cottons. And that house was located very, very close to the modern Green Man roundabout. And this was their estate, and they sold it off in plots for development. Same process that we'd seen in Forest Gate. There were different people doing development in different ways. I've mentioned the Cotton family selling off their estate, but this is a slightly different model. This is, there's an interesting story behind this. This is the Conservative Land Society, and they were encouraging people to move to the area so that they actually would become conservative sort of voters. It smacks slightly of sort of Lady Porter's shenanigans in Westminster in the 1980s, and the scandal of council homes being sold off to get more Tory voters in a particular ward. Well, there's nothing new under the sun, so this is something somewhat similar going on in the 19th century, because the franchise, the right to vote, had been extended several times in the latter part of the 19th century, and people with lower levels of income were gradually getting the vote. And obviously, one of the ways political parties could get people to vote is by them buying into property and enfranchising themselves. So there's another type of development process going on. And here's another one. This, in fact, is the Manor Park Cemetery. I think there's a caption to come. Yes, there it is. So the Manor Park Cemetery lies between Forest Gate Railway Station and Manor Park. And originally they wanted to build a cemetery all the way between those two stations, but the local, it wasn't the council, but the local government of the time said they couldn't. So they built a cemetery on half the side, half the plot, near Manor Park Station, the cemetery that's still there, and I'm sure many of you have been there. But the rest of the land was, in fact, developed as housing and became that part of Forest Gate between the station and the cemetery. So in this case, sort of indirectly, the cemetery company became the sort of, if you like, the chief developer. And they put some quite interesting clauses in when it was divided up, when the estate was divided up for development. They put in various clauses to try and control what was going on, because they wanted sort of respectable people, if you like, in inverted commas, in their area. And the deeds of the houses still have, if you've got the historic deeds to a house in Forest Gate on the old set, the land that was owned by the cemetery company, you still have these clauses in your deeds. Obviously, they wanted to control alcohol, they wanted to control noisy businesses, smelly businesses. And many deeds in Victorian suburbs have these kind of phrases, trying to control people's behaviour through the land transactions. I've mentioned already the Tottenham and Forest Gate Railway Company as a developer in the area, as they built their line in the mid 1890s, and they actually bought up sort of too many and sold some off, and I think this is them selling them off in 1893. Notice in the middle there it says for investment, occupation, or speculation. Again, speculation was going on in the 19th century, and of course it goes on today with modern gentrification and buy-to-let mortgages and people investing in letting. There we go, investment, occupational speculation. And here's another interesting contemporary advert from Forest Gate. This is Seabrook Road, very close to the cemetery, in fact. And the interesting thing here is, oh, sorry, skipped on. The interesting thing here is that these houses were not built with bathrooms. This is from the late 19th century, but Victorians actually were rather, they really liked the idea of toilets inside the house. They thought it rather unhygienic, so the toilet was outside. But in this case, interestingly, there was a sort of bathroom, but it wasn't plumbed in. There were no fittings. As you can see, it says unfitted bathroom. So there was a room available to put in a bath, but certainly not the toilet, and that only came later. And indeed, many Forest Gate houses, newer houses, did not have internal plumbing, internal bathrooms, internal toilets until, excuse me, the 1970s or the 1980s. And on that point, I'm going to hand over to Mark, who's going to pick up the theme of developers.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. As we said at the beginning, we wanted to talk not just about Forest Gate, but also to do some comparison with other parts of northeast London, and Walthamstow, of course, was growing in a similar way, but perhaps at a slightly different pace from Forest Gate and Leytonstone. But here is the sort of central kind of developer in Walthamstow in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, the Warner estate. Peter was just mentioning the Tottenham Forest Gate Railway. The Warner family were very heavily involved in developing that railway. They saw the opportunity to have a rail access to northeast London, and then to benefit from it through developing estates like the Warner estate, which began in the 1880s and was not really completed until the 1930s. This advertisement is from the end of the First World War, so you can see the sort of rental level. And Peter earlier showed a quotation which talked about rents in Forest Gate being from 7 and 6 a week. Here we see about 20 years later that you could get really quite a substantial house for 22 and sixpence per week, which was probably in modern terms around £30. And when you think that this was a time when a factory worker would have been earning, say, £4 a week, 22 and sixpence, just over £1. So a quarter of his wages would go on rent, which actually in today's terms doesn't sound too bad at all. The Warner family were the lords of the manor, of course, of Walthamstow, and they were one of the few lords of the manor around London that actually turned themselves into property developers as opposed to selling their land off for development. Okay, next slide, Peter. Thanks. Peter mentioned Forest Gate Station earlier on, and I think we can't overemphasize the importance of the railway for the development of northeast London. The Eastern Counties Railway was the first to build eastwards from London. They were taken over by a company called the Great Eastern, which dominated the whole of northeast London for many years. But as Peter said, the early years of Forest Gate's railway were rather checkered. In fact, business was so poor that this station closed for a few years until a petition sort of got it reopened. But we found this picture very recently, in the last week, in fact, in the Newham archive, and it shows an early station building, which was very much like a domestic house. Of course, the station master would have lived there. So appropriate for small numbers of travellers. Next slide, please. But by the end of the 19th century, that station had been replaced by a much bigger one. Here is Forest Gate Station, which actually looks more or less like the station as it is today, with some alteration. This picture is interesting because it shows not only the railway, but also two other modes of transport popular locally, the tramways, which were a cheap and very popular way of getting around the area. Come back to that in a moment. And also the bike. You can see this lady on a bicycle on the right hand side, and again just return to that that topic a little later. So next slide, please. So Forest Gate Station was catered for a really mixed bunch of commuters. The early trains, the very early trains, were by law, they had to be at a very cheap rate. They were called parliamentary trains because there was an act of parliament which obliged the railway companies to transport workers to work in the very early hours. For the first trains left at 5 o'clock in the morning, and the return fare to Forest Gate or to Walthamstow to into Liverpool Street in the 1880s was twopence, which was very affordable. The railway companies complained about these workmen's trains and said that they were the source of all kinds of iniquities. They complained about workers cooking herrings in the train and stealing the leather straps for the windows. But I think that given the fact that they ran far more of these trains than they were actually mandated to, means that they probably were turning quite a nice profit. But Forest Gate had, as Peter said, a very mixed demographic. And you can see on the left, this is obviously a later train, and a top-hatted gent is about to depart on this train to London. Next slide, please. And again, Peter, could you click on it again? There's a caption. The back of this card says, "We don't catch this train, the 9:18 from Leytonstone. When we start, it's busier than this." So that the railways were carrying more and more people. And you can see from this photograph, Leytonstone in 1905, that it wasn't just top-hatted bankers and workmen, but also the great majority of people travelling on the trains from northeast London by the 1900s were city clerks. And Walthamstow, Forest Gate, Leytonstone became the par excellence, the place where lower middle class and upper working class people could afford to live and commute into work. Next slide, please. However, in those days, just like now, there were problems on the railways. And here's John Wilkinson of Forest Gate up before the magistrates because he got into a fight with a chap called Alfred Wright in a crowded train on its way to Ilford. Poor old Alfred Wright had ended up with a black eye because he'd complained about Wilkinson and a friend trying to force himself into a full compartment. And this caused Wilkinson to get a 10 shilling fine and a talking to from the chairman of the magistrates. So it shows, again, as Peter said, there's not much that's new under the sun. Problems on the railways through overcrowding were a problem in those days too. Next slide, please. And because of the stress of travel, you could relieve that by getting a cup of tea on the station. This is actually a sign that still exists, a ghost sign at East Ham Underground Station now. Tea at twopence a cup. There would have been a refreshment room on the platform. This is the London-bound platform, so you could imagine in 130 years ago that the clerks and the businessmen going into London, getting their early morning cup of tea. You can also just see to the left of the sign, in the wrought ironwork, the very elaborate initials of the railway company. It's actually in reverse, but it says LTSR, London, Tilbury and Southend Railway. The companies were very proud of their image and they promoted themselves in every way possible. You can also see on various stations around Walthamstow and Leytonstone signs of the old GER, the Great Eastern Railway, similarly in wrought ironwork. Next slide, please. And it wasn't just about commuting. You could also go on holiday excursions from the area. And you can see here at the bottom, you can see that you could get to Burnham on Crouch and Southminster for a third class return of 1 and 6pence. This was about, I think this is in the 18, oh, well, yes, it's 1894. So this is the August bank holiday weekend, probably, getting cheap excursions out into Essex. So people were beginning to go further and further out of London for their entertainments, and the railways were providing the opportunity to do that. So you could get trains from all around the northeast London area. You can see Forest Gate, Manor Park, Guildford, Leytonstone and Snaresborough all provided services to the coast and the country and the Essex countryside. Next slide, please. So if you stayed in Forest Gate, you could flock to a place like the Grand Theatre. This was opened in the early 1900s. It was also called the Forest Gate Public Hall. It went through many incarnations in its time, and it ended its sort of dramatic life with in the 1960s with Jimi Hendrix. But in the 1900s, it was a place where it showed the transition actually from theatre, from one-act plays being put on to film, because in an evening you could actually see, go to the Grand, you could see a drama, a one-act play, 2 or 3 films, which would be one reelers, that's about 15 minutes, and then back to another play again. And they even had sound in 1910. They experimented with playing songs and choruses from operas on film with a gramophone. I don't know how effective that was, but it was certainly a pioneering effort in sound cinema. Next slide, Peter. So Peter's mentioned that Forest Gate, like many of the suburbs, had very busy shopping centre. This is Wood Grange Road, the heart of Forest Gate. And as Peter said, there were some very grand shops. People shop locally. That's how you shop. They shopped in small amounts, and they shopped in these local shops. It was an event to go to a shop further away at Stratford or even in West End. And you can see all along, see the awnings out of these shops. The tramway obviously taking people to the shops, but also many people just walked the shops, be very close and local. And Peter, if you just click on the arrow, the slide, you can see here, this is a company called Steedman. It was a bakery in Maryland near Stratford. And you could, if you didn't want to go to the shop, you can get the baker's roundsman to bring bread and cakes to your door. Next slide, please. And here's another baker's roundsman. This is C.H. Smith in Odessa Road, Forest Gate. And I think this picture was taken just after the First World War, when they still, obviously, they were still using horse-drawn transport. And again, deliveries to your door from G.H. Smith, who's a baker and a pastry cook. Next slide, Peter. So also there was, of course, the attraction of nearby open spaces, which made suburbs like Forest Gate and Walthamstow especially attractive. And here's Wanstead Flats, which could be reached even more easily when the tramway was built in the early 1900s. And there you can see the end of the line for the tramway on what is now Centre Road, Forest Gate. Tramways were very popular. Trams were very cheap and a very easy means to get around. In fact, it was a complete tragedy that they were ripped out of London in the 1930s to 1950s. It was a huge mistake, because they still today provide a very affordable and quick means of getting around. Next slide, please. So entertainments on the flats were multiple. Here's the bandstand that at the western end of the flats. There were 2 on Wanstead Flats in the 1900s. This was considered to be the better of the 2. although the local residents from those houses you can see behind used to complain about the Sunday crowds, about too many people turning up. Bands became very popular. Next slide, please. And fairs and circuses on the flats have been popular for many years. And when the fair was on the flats, the costermongers from East London would park their barrows and bring their donkeys out to the flats. They did this on Sundays anyway, but when the fairs and circuses arrived, they had even better business. And you can see here a summer's day in the 1890s. Notice how people are dressed, the boy on the right and the girl on the left, sort of dressed in very heavy clothes, despite the fact that this must have been a very hot day, you can see from the shadows. Next slide, please. And the fair has been a fixture of Wanstead Flats on the edge of Forest Gate for, well, we're not sure, we've done a lot of research, but we can't actually pin down a start date for the fair on the flats. We think it may have originated with gypsies and travellers in the mid-19th century, the 1850s, may even have been a horse fair. But by the 1900s, it became a very big event. And even poor weather, like you see here, this is Easter 1938, not a very promising day. But the fair still attracted vast numbers of people. And it still amazingly does today. COVID has not killed off the fair on Wanstead Flats. It was back this year. And it looks like it's going to be a fixture for years to come. Next slide, please. So Forest Gate also became a very important centre for cycling because it was right on the edge of Epping Forest, because it was, it's in a fairly flat area, the Lee Valley and up into the forest. Cycling became very popular. It was very popular across the country, especially after the invention of the pneumatic tyre and the safety bicycle in the 1880s. And Forest Gate became a centre for bike manufacture. By 1900, there were no fewer than 17 bike builders in Forest Gate. This was the biggest, Clark Brothers. They were the biggest manufacturers in London in the 1900s. They were turning out 2,400 bikes a year. Half of those were ladies' bikes, they were for women. And bikes were very affordable. You could buy a bike for £5 to £7 when a clerk might have been earning, that might have been perhaps 2 to 3 weeks wages for a clerk in the city. So they were quite affordable at the time. And next slide, please, Peter. And they were widely used. Here is Wanstead Flats looking south towards Forest Gate in the early 1900s. And again, you can see very clearly in the foreground a woman on a bike, and actually there's another one not quite so clear a little bit further back. For women, the cycling revolution was really revolutionary. It was very incredibly liberating, and women actually joined cycling clubs in almost as great numbers as men. Next slide, please, Peter. And these cycling clubs, there were many in Forest Gate and in Walthamstow and in Leytonstone, often based around the pub. And again, they started to go further and further afield. And here is the Robin Hood pub on the road to Epping. This pub still exists today. And this crossroads, which is now a small roundabout, is still just about recognisable, a lot busier than it is in this photo. But you can see cyclists on a summer's day have come out, probably a cycling club, come out to enjoy the forest. And you can also see in the background there what was called a brake, a four-wheeled horse-drawn wagon, which would have brought a big party out from East London to enjoy the forest. So the forest was providing a lot of entertainment for the growing populations of North East London. Next slide, please. And one of those, Epping Forest and the the fringes of Epping Forest around Snaresbrook and Whipps Cross have an important role to play in the history of the development of football in this country, because this club, the Forest Football Club, which was begun by two former public school boys who lived in the Snaresbrook area in the 1860s. This club later, several of them then later moved to South London and reformed the club as the Wanderers. One of these footballers in this picture, who is, I think, fourth from the left, C.W. Alcott, sorry, fifth from the left, C.W. Alcott, was a leading light in the beginnings of the English Football Association in the 1860s. But this club played very close to Whipps Cross. We don't exactly know where, but certainly on forest land in that area. Next slide, please, Peter. Well, I've talked quite a bit about tramways, and here's a tram at Whipps Cross on Whipps Cross Road in 1938. These trams were developed in the 1930s, were much faster and bigger than the previous tram, and again bringing literally thousands of people out into the forest. And you can see here, actually it's amazingly deserted. Obviously it's a sunny winter's day, there's no leaves on that tree, but on just to the left there you can see hollow ponds on the edge of Epping Forest. Next slide, Peter. And hollow ponds actually was dug in the 1890s. It was one of those job creation projects. Unemployed workers, many from the docks, came out to work on the pond, and it was dug by manual labour, and then used by local people. The first commercial use was a Miss Searle, who owned these boats here. She paid £210 a year to put her boats on the hollow ponds, and they quickly became extremely popular, as did another activity in this area. Next slide, please, Peter. That's the hollow ponds in winter. Again, you can see how popular they were, despite the fact that there were numerous accidents with people falling through the ice and one or two drownings. But in those pre-health and safety days, this was taken as a sort of a hazard of winter life. Next slide, please. And this shows the digging in the 1900s of a now lost and but not forgotten feature of Whipps Cross, the Whipps Cross Lido, which was first dug in 1907 as a natural lake, again by unemployed workers. You can see them there, and again you can see the vast amount of physical labour that went into digging these spaces. Next slide, please. The Lido had a rather checkered history, and it was not very successful in its early days, and it was only in the 1930s that it was completely rebuilt and lined with concrete, and then reopened in 1937. And this you can see in its first year of reopening. It became hugely popular, and there may be people watching tonight who remember it. On a hot summer's day, great crowds would come and queues would form. But sadly, its days were numbered in the 1980s. Sorry about the quality of these pictures. It's the only one we could find of the destruction of the Lido in the early 1980s. And now, of course, it's completely lost in the scrub, just on the other, just north of the Whipps Cross, around Whipps Cross corner. And we thought we'd finish just with a feature of life which was important both in Walthamstow and in Forest Gate for a brief period of time at the end of the Second World War, and that's the construction of what were really sort of small towns of prefab housing. And here's some prefabs on Whips Cross Road in 1945. This was I think this is a party for a VE Day party, and you can see the prefabs that were occupied by people bombed out of the East End during the Blitz. These are fairly basic, but prefabs were much loved by the people who lived in them, because they provided, for the first time, they provided many of the facilities that people had not had in their houses in East London. They provided proper kitchens with cookers, inside toilets and proper bathrooms, hot running water, and in some cases gardens. But next slide, please, Peter. But sadly, their days again were numbered, and this is, you can see hollow ponds in the background. This is the last of those prefabs that this picture was taken in 1960, just before their final demolition. But they're a reminder of how much our area has gone through change over so many years, and how it continues to change today, and how features that we think are permanent suddenly disappear and are lost. And that's, I suppose, the sort of our final message, that it's this is a story of continual change. So our booklets on Wanstead Flats are available if you want to purchase them. We've put in this shameless advertisement. So thank you very much for your attention, and if there are any questions, we would be happy to try to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both Peter and Mark. That was absolutely fascinating and really well illustrated as well. So a real pleasure to listen and find out about the development of Forest Gate, and also thank you very much for taking the extra effort to put in links sort of closer to home at St Peter's. So particularly stuff about the Lido at Whips Cross was fascinating, and those images of the prefabs it's really nice to see. As I mentioned, you're of course all muted, but if you do have questions, please write them in the chat box and I'll ask them to Peter and Mark. In the meantime, I do have a couple of questions of my own to get the ball rolling. So one of the sort of interesting comparisons about population increase is that whereas Walthamstow's population grew rapidly and in a similar exponential manner to that of Forest Gate, Chingford, just slightly further down the tracks, didn't, because the cheaper workers' fare only went up to Walthamstow. So I was just wondering if you knew where along the Forest Gate line was the sort of end of that sort of buffer where people would commonly be commuting to the centre of London.
Well, I don't know the exact point at which the Great Eastern, I think it was Ilford actually, but I'm not absolutely sure of that. But it was, it is interesting. It's a fascinating story of cheap fares, because there's no doubt that Walthamstow and Forest Gate and Leytonstone, they are as they are largely because of those cheap fares, because it was possible for people to commute in. And actually, it is actually said that homebound partygoers in top hats and evening dress were seen taking the early trains, because the cheap fare trains would come in at 5 o'clock in the morning, then they'd go back empty. So, because they had to do at least 2 runs. So the toffs were using the cheap trains to go, it was alleged, to go home. But I think Chingford also, I think it was, I think Chingford was developed partly by the Warner family. They had some, they had some say in that, and they deliberately, they saw it as a more upmarket area, definitely. It may have, yes. So, but I think, short answer to your question, I think Ilford was the boundary, of the cheap fares from this part of London.
Thanks, Mark. Peter, you mentioned the Woods Grange estate as being a sort of carefully planned and laid out estate in Forest Gate, and also the Warner name has come up numerous times, and just them as well. And they were really, you know, prolific house builders across the borough of Waltham Forest. You know, so there's some development very close to St Peter's, right in the east of the borough, and then also some right in the west near the marshes that separate Waltham Forest with Tottenham. I was wondering, is there a similar sort of family name associated with development across Forest Gate, or was it a bit more sort of piecemeal?
There isn't a Warner equivalent in the modern London borough of Newham. Yes, Warner is sort of unique to Waltham Forest, really, but there is one very interesting survival in Newham. There was a family called Scrutton, and to this day, they still own hundreds of flats and houses in the on the border of Canning Town and Plaistow. They have sold off some now into owner occupation, but it's a family-run business, still running quite traditional lines, and they still have rentals, both flats and houses. My professional life was in Newham Housing Department, and I had many dealings with Scrutton over the years. And yes, it's not on the scale of Warner, and it had a even more focus on sort of working class community, being sort of Canning Town Plaistow. But Scrutton is a very interesting survival. I mentioned Corbett, who developed the very middle class Wood Grange estate. There is a wonderful film on YouTube that somebody made about 3 or 4 years ago about Corbett as housing developers. And it doesn't just cover Forest Gate. They have a large estate in South London and a couple of large estates in sort of Ilford, Seven Kings area. And I would thoroughly recommend the film about Corbett that is on YouTube. It was professionally made, and it's an hour long, and it gives an amazing insight into. I mean, they're a very interesting family anyway, the Corbetts, and the film talks about other aspects of their family life that isn't just the housing, but the main emphasis is on housing. And the Wood Grange estate was very much it was aimed very much at a middle class community. The houses are quite large. And in modern times, it became a conservation area, and the houses change hands now for anything up to 1.3, 1.5 million, I suppose. But they are quite substantial Victorian villas. But it has an architectural coherence that some of the ordinary terrace streets don't have.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Peter. We've got a question from someone who I don't know the name of, I'm afraid. But they've asked, do you have any information on Teapot Jones, who owned a grocery shop in Forest Gate? He became quite well known and had a large image of a teapot hanging outside his shop, hence his nickname. Apparently he was very wealthy when he died. So I don't know if either of you recognise the name of this character.
I don't. And what do we know? I wonder what sort of period we're talking about. Because I don't think I've ever seen an image of a teapot hanging outside a shop, Forest Gate. But well, we'll have to check that one out.
Mark and I are involved in something called Newham Heritage Month, which is promoted by the council, and it happens in May each year. And in May 2020, there was quite a significant project done by a local artist on shops in Forest Gate and Wood Grange Road, and in fact Mark's wife was involved in that project, and they dug out a lot of very lovely old photographs. But I must say, we have, as Mark says, we've not seen a teapot hanging outside, but we might be following that up.
That's some research that our unknown caller could follow up themselves, but that sounds like an interesting story there.
Yeah.
I think our final question from the evening that I'm going to put to Peter and Mark is from Ian, who asks, is the City of London Corporation still involved with the Wanstead flats?
Oh, that's a question for Mark.
They are. Yes, they are. Yeah. I mean, the Wanstead Flats is part of Epping Forest. So the City of London is, well, yeah, Epping Forest is now a charity. It's actually a charity with one trustee, which is the City of London Corporation. But it's a sort of it's now an arm's length. It's like an arm's length agency, although, I mean, it is a registered charity. I think that's for fundraising purposes. But yes, City of London still manages Wanstead Flats as they do Leighton Flats, of course, and Whips Cross, the Hollow Ponds, is also managed by the City of London. For better or worse, long may they continue to be so. We have many spirited exchanges of views with the City of London about their management practices. However, by and large, we have to say that they've been very good stewards of the forest over the years, and continue to be so. And one of the things that I think that one of the challenges the forest faces in the 21st century, as it always has, is the threat from development. And we didn't talk much tonight about the way that Forest Gate and Walthamstow and Leytonstone lapped up to the edges of Epping Forest really from the mid-Victorian period, in the 1860s onwards, and how there was a huge battle fought to defend the forest from development, which heavily involved actually people from Forest Gate and Walthamstow in these areas, and who, ordinary people who, as we've seen, really valued the forest for its open spaces and its sort of opportunities for leisure. The role of the City of London has been very, very important in maintaining that, and continues to be so today. They continue to do battle with developers who are always trying to nibble away at the edge of the forest, even though it's protected by an Act of Parliament. Doesn't stop the developers. Nothing stops developers, does it? I won't get going on that. A different topic.
I think that's a nice note to finish on, alongside the other brief things you mentioned along the way there about history, repeating these various patterns, people fighting on trains, development companies being ruthless is, I'm sure, nothing new and nothing that will go away anytime soon.